Catherine McDonald. I'm the chair of the Oregon Global Warming Commission. And I'd like to bring the January 13th meeting of the Global Warming Commission to order. We'll take roll call a little bit later after a few updates. And also wanted to thank the public for, excuse me, the public comments we got. I was very enthusiastic to see requests from several high school students to learn more about what the commission is doing to address climate change, and have already reached back out to them to set up time for us to talk next week. So I was really pleased to see that interest and engagement of high school students in our work. I also wanted to commend the Oregon Climate Change Research Institute for their recent release of the 6th climate assessment for the state of Oregon. I haven't had a chance to dig into it in detail yet, but did note that they have done dug in more on kind of the existing economic impacts of climate change on Oregon's economy. Encourage people to go to their website, which is shown here. There's also a blog that Odo staff did about the assessment. So it was great to see that, and we will certainly want to reflect some of the information in that assessment in our report to the legislature. And then also wanted to,
McDonald?
Yes.
One more point on that Odo blog. So Amy Schuster on our staff put that together, and it's a summary of the entire report. So if you don't have the bandwidth or time to be able to read the entire thing, or that's probably a good way to get the it's more detailed than just 1 or 2 pages, numerous pages, but it gives you a really good overview of the assessment.
Yeah, it is. Thank you. Okay. And then I don't see Senator Dembrow on the meeting yet.
Yeah, I'm here, Chair.
Oh, great, Senator Dembrow. Do you want to speak to the 2 bills that you have that are pertinent to at least 2 of the bills that are pertinent to the Global Warming Commission?
Sure. We talked about this at the last meeting. I'm not sure that we had bill numbers at that point, but we do have now both Senate Bill 522 and Senate Bill 530, which are, came out of the work. Well, one is directly related to the work of this committee and to this commission, and the other came out of its work. The first one is, a bill to kind of modernize the work of the commission, to update our goals. And I don't know if there's going to be a conversation around that this meeting.
There is, yes.
Here. Okay, yeah. In its current form, it brings our goals up to where the governor's executive order is, but I think we committed last time to have further conversation around that. So that aspect may be amended, but it would kind of stabilize the capacity of the commission. We actually changed the name of the commission to the Oregon Climate Action Commission, and clarify its role in collecting information and coordinating the state's work on climate action, and give it the capacity to be able to do that. The other bill, the Senate Bill 530, is the Natural Climate Solutions Bill that comes out of the work that the Commission did on natural and working lands to clarify the role of natural and working lands in our state to sequester and store carbon, and to to be an integral part of our climate action agenda. Coordinate again the work that's done in this area, both in terms of use of our forests, rangelands, marshlands, agriculture, urban canopies, etc. And to create a fund that would help coordinate investments coming in from the federal government and also state investments. So these are for people who are watching this. I'd encourage you to go on to the Legislative Information System. Here are the links. Check out the bills. If you have any suggestions around potential amendments, please email me. This will be a process. Both of these bills will involve expenditures, and so both of them will go to the Ways and Means Committee. So these we won't get these fully resolved until the very end of the session, but I expect that work on them will continue throughout the session, and I look forward to participation from the commissioners as well as members of the public.
Thank you, Senator Dembro. And I put a link to the workforce request for information. I think I might have said at our last meeting that it had been posted on this website, but we actually just got it posted a few days ago. So if you went looking for it and didn't find it, here's a link to that request for information, and it will be going out soon. And then we'll use that to inform our scope of work for a workforce and training assessment associated with implementation of natural and working lands proposal. So for those that might be interested in looking at that or actually responding to the request for information, do feel free to reach out to me and I can get you in touch with the folks at the Institute for Natural Resources. Going back to the legislative session, Oregon Department of Energy staff will be providing regular updates on all of the bills that are pertinent to the Commission's mission. And each time we meet, they'll give us an update on the status of those bills and what committees they're in and whether or not they've moved, and as the session goes along, whether they're still alive and under consideration. So that's something that they will do for us as commissioners, but also provide important information to the public so that people can engage in the legislative process and decision-making around climate action. So I want to thank Odo and staff in advance for making that commitment to do that for us. Any other updates before we do the roll call? Commissioners would like to share? If I don't see that you've raised your hand, go ahead and just unmute yourself. And okay. Linda, will you remind the public how they can let us know that they want to provide public testimony, which we will be taking near the end of our meeting today? If you just remind folks how they can do that.
Certainly. At the very bottom of your screen, you'll see a little emoji and a hand. If you want to go ahead and click on that, a hand will come up and you will show up on my screen as wanting to have a question or wanting to make a comment. Please do that. Please do so during the public comment, or if you're on the phone, go ahead and hit *3 and that will also raise your hand and I can unmute you. That is for the people attending. The individuals, the panelists, you may go ahead and unmute and mute yourself as you need to. And I know Kathy encourages you to go ahead and unmute yourself. And if you want to raise your hand, you're welcome to as well.
Thank you, Linda.
You're welcome.
I will now do a roll call. Commissioner Reitman,
Yes, I'm here.
Commissioner Jackson,
Here.
Commissioner Apter,
Here.
Commissioner Shippentauer,
Here.
Commissioner Ford,
Here.
Commissioner Sheeran.
Here.
Did I miss any of the voting members? If not, then I'll go to the non-voting members. Commissioner Potowski,
Here.
Director Bateman.
Here. Good morning.
Good morning. Representative Brock Smith.
Brock Smith is here.
Excellent. Senator Dembro.
I'm here.
And then we have Sierra, who's with Senator Finley's office.
Hello, yes, I'm here.
Welcome. Thank you for joining us. And Nicole Singh from DEQ.
Yes, I'm here.
Excellent. Gabriella, are you representing Rachel?
Yes.
Right.
Good morning.
Welcome. Nels Johnson and Mary Moreland, are you officially representing Commissioner Anderson?
Yeah, I am.
Okay,
It's
thank
Nels.
you. Who else am I missing? And Judith, are you representing the Department of Agriculture, Judith Collins? Kellens, excuse me. Okay, thank you. We'll go ahead and recognize people if they show up a little bit late during the meeting as the meeting's ongoing. So with that, I think we can go to our first agenda item. And there is a lot of information that staff have pulled together for us. And a lot of it got to us a little later than we had hoped. So this is really the purpose of this meeting, is to kind of walk through all that information, make sure people understand how we arrived at it, talk about how we might want to use the information in our report. And we will take public comment on the recommendations and all the information that we present today through the 25th. So with that, thank you, Zach, for showing the timeline. So we'll take public comments, also agency comments on some of the information through the 25th. We're going to be sending out a notice about our next meeting, which will be February 3rd in the morning from 9 to 1. And then we hope that we can finalize the report later in February and then get it to the legislature by March 1st. And we'll come back to this question, the timeline, at the end of the meeting, and just check in to make sure that commissioners feel like we are on track to be able to keep this schedule, or if commissioners might want a little more time to think about the final report and to weigh in on it. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn things over to Alan to walk us through all of the information from the evaluation that he led of all the actions. Alan,
Chair McDonald, can you hear me okay?
I can.
Great. Next slide, please, Zach.
Hey, Alan and Chair McDonald, sorry, I'm having audio issues here. So I'm working off of the phone and computer, so I just need a second to be able to switch the slides, and that's why you haven't been able to hear me.
Okay.
So just give me a minute. Thank you.
So while Zach's doing that, I'll just kind of go over what we're planning to do today. So we're going to do a little bit of review at the beginning, the purpose of the ranking and the scoring and ranking process, just to refresh that in people's minds. Then look at, and then as you recall, last time we looked at the results through different lenses, meaning different evaluation criteria that we looked at. And when we did that, we got very different results depending on which lens you looked at. And because of that, we had a really robust discussion to talk about what would be the guidance to the staff in order to implement the action recommendation process. And thanks to Commissioner Jackson, led that off basically. And so we used that guidance to then craft the action recommendation process, which led to the results from using that guidance, which resulted in the draft action recommendation. So next slide, please, Zach. If you recall, we had back up one step. We did this analysis for the electrification scenario, and then we replicated the exact same analysis for the hybrid scenario. So we did exactly the same thing to both of the scenarios. So it becomes a little bit redundant, but we had to do it for both the scenarios, and then we combined them at the end into a final recommendation that looked at both of the scenarios. Just so I don't bury the lead, what we're recommending is because of the urgency of the climate change issue, because all of the actions actually need to be implemented in both the scenarios for them to meet the goals. So we recommended moving all of the actions forward, and that meant all of the actions from the electrification scenario and the 4 unique actions from the hybrid scenario. We recommended moving them all. We tiered them as to priority of implementation into tiers 1, 2, and 3, because as Commissioner Jackson said, we cannot do this all at once with all of them all at once. So the need to be able to tier them to give direction to decision makers about what should be the highest priority, second priority, and third priority is the way that we built this recommendation for the for action. So as you recall, we went through this analysis last time, but I'm going to go over it really quickly. We looked at the prioritization or ranking of the actions based on their greenhouse gas emission amounts. Then we looked at their cost effectiveness, and then the 3 co-benefits score only, and then the total evaluation score. And we also looked at it for risk and uncertainty. And so each one of those resulted in a different ranking. So next slide, please, Zach. And then next slide, 2 slides, please. So we did the electrification scenario first. So this is the electrification scenario based on the rankings of greenhouse gas reduction amount. That was the #1 evaluation criteria with almost 1/3 of the points. and this is the ranking of those actions based on how much greenhouse gas emissions they reduce. You can see there's a wide variety from quite large amounts of greenhouse gas emissions on the far left and very little on the far right. And so so they naturally kind of grouped into 3 tiers as well, 1, 2, and 3. And so when we did, then we started resorting this graph or redoing the analysis based on different criteria. Next slide, please, Zach. So if we resorted them by the cost effectiveness, then this is the results of that. You'll notice that we kept the tier 1 green bars, the ones that had the highest greenhouse gas emission reductions, as green bars. We'll do that throughout the entire analysis, so you can keep track of that tier 1 highest greenhouse gas reduction emission amount actions. So this shows that not all of the in this graph, the actions on the left are the most cost-effective actions at dollars per metric ton reduced, and the ones on the right are the least cost-effective. And you can see that if you tiered them by this or prioritized the recommendation were based purely on cost effectiveness, you wouldn't capture the highest greenhouse gas emission reduction amounts in the first tier. They would be probably in tier 2 and a bunch of them in tier 3. Next slide, please, Zach. So we resorted the same greenhouse gas emission reduction graph by co-benefits, only the 3 co-benefits: equity, health, and jobs. And you can see that when we did that resort, we did preserve most of the high greenhouse gas emission reduction actions, but some of them got into tier 2 and some probably got into tier 3. And we did pull in some very low ones into the first tier and some of these below average ones in tier 1 as well. So that would result in a very different analysis or prioritization scheme as well. Next slide, please, Zach. When we look at all of the evaluation criteria, that's all 6 criteria: greenhouse gas reduction amount, cost effectiveness, equity, health, jobs, and risk and uncertainty. That was the total score. So it's kind of the one that brings together all of the different considerations in evaluating these things that the commission put forward using that weighting. That brought the tier 1 back to all of the high greenhouse gas reduction amount actions back into tier 1, but also pulled in some average ones or below average ones from maybe tier 2 and tier 3 into the high priority scheme. So that would result in a different scheme as well. Next slide, please, Zach. Then we resorted the graph based on risk and uncertainty score, only that score. We got another set of tiering. So, and that preserved some of the high greenhouse gas reduction amount actions, put some of them into tier 2, but also pulled in some below average greenhouse gas reduction amount actions into tier 1. So what this really demonstrates is that depending on which lens you look at through, you can develop a very different prioritization recommendation, and they could be significantly different. Next slide, please, Zach. So, and go one more. So this is what we did to develop it. We took what Commissioner Jackson said and went back and listened to that discussion. And it was a very good discussion, by the way, if you go back and listen to it. And so we wrote down what Commissioner Jackson said and what other people kibitzed on that, but we got pretty majority, if not all, of the commission agreed with this approach to doing developing their action recommendation. And basically, that guidance was that we should start with the greenhouse gas reduction amount. That should be the primary focus And then focus on actions. So that would allow us to focus on actions that had the biggest results or outcomes first, and allow us to demonstrate a path forward with early actions that have the greatest impact. So, and then after considering greenhouse gas reduction amount, we would then take into consideration the ones that are most cost effective and the ones that have co-benefits. We also added into the discussion looking at the score, the evaluation score, federal grants, and risk and uncertainty. And then also risk and uncertainty will help us determine which ones of them need further study, and we'll get to that towards the end. Next slide, please, Zach. So this is that same graph. It's the ranking of the greenhouse gas reduction amount in the electrification scenario. And you get tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. What we're going to do is then look at what happens to these actions when we look through these different lenses and see if these tiers should be changed. So should any of these tier 2 things pop into tier 1, or should tier 3 pop into tier 2 because of the different criteria that we'd be looking at. Next slide, please, Zach. So when we looked at cost effectiveness, and when we noted cost effectiveness here, most of them have a red, are turned into a red bar, but their cost effectiveness ranking is the number above these bars. So you can see that these are the top 10 most cost effective actions. Only one of the tier 1 greenhouse gas reduction amount actions is in the top 10. 7, 5, and 8 are in, and 6 are in tier 2, and then there's various ones that are in tier 3. The one recommendation the one that stood out most for us in terms of shifting and keeping in mind the primary focus, which is greenhouse gas reduction amount, so the biggest, tallest bars, which ones of these should shift. We didn't think any of them should shift from tier 2 into tier 3, but we did think that the food waste program should shift from tier 3 into tier 2 because of its second highest ranking in terms of cost effectiveness. So the first recommendation is shift food waste into tier 2 from tier 3.
Alan,
slide, please.
why didn't you move? Why aren't you suggesting moving the number 1 ranked?
The things below that kind of violated the primary focus of the guidance, which was greenhouse gas emission amounts. So the ones that are towards the right hand of the screen have very little greenhouse gas emission reduction total. They might be important, they might be great programs, but they don't have a lot of greenhouse gas emission reductions associated with them. And then that conversation, if you recall, during the meeting where we said the ones that it almost takes as much to put together a program and implement a very low greenhouse gas reducing action as it does to do a high greenhouse gas emission reduction. So the ones that are on the lower end of the scale probably take almost as much time as the ones on the left. So we didn't want to spend a lot of time or prioritize the time on the ones that didn't have the biggest impact. So the only one we thought that should move from tier 3 to tier 2 was that food waste program.
I just want to invite Director Bateman maybe to speak to the urban density action and kind of.
Thank you for that, Chair. Yes, so I'm always amazed when I look at this graph because number 1 and number 3 are, squarely within our wheelhouse and things that we're paying attention to as part of our climate friendly and equitable communities program. So it saddens me to see them so far to the right on this graph, particularly because I'm just wondering if the metric here that places them so far to the right doesn't truly encapsulate all of the cascading effects and domino effects that the density and floor plan programs might have in terms of the community, the culture, the behaviors that it engenders that help get to our goal. So I'm just wondering, and I'm working with my staff and with your staff as well to figure out whether those metrics fully encapsulate all of the behaviors and levers that actually get us to the climate change goals. This is a big part of what we do and where we've based and housed our climate friendly and equitable community rules and program here in the past many months and years. So I'd welcome more conversation with staff. Obviously, this is something we're going to do anyway here at the department and with our stakeholders and commission and local government partners, regardless of where we land on the scale and on the graphs here. But we would like to see more credit given to these programs and really more acknowledgement of the role they can play. But I certainly understand that we kind of did this by the numbers. I'm just wondering if the numbers fully recognize the power of these zoning and programmatic approaches.
Really good questions and good thoughts. And it made me think about whether we want to maybe identify some things that are enabling, as to your point, that other things rely on, and also, to some extent recognize things that are underway, such as all of that great work that you and ODOT and Odo did around that work. Similarly, a lot of work is happening on congestion pricing, and it's, our like 5 years into that the analysis. And so, whether or not we want to acknowledge that there are some things that are underway that, it would be cost effective to get them over the finish line. And not to imply that they're not important.
Right. Well, and I mean, just to put a finer point on it, these two particular bars on the graph too, are closely tied to air quality and household energy and fuel savings, as well as increased activity. And we've got the health and the human benefits too of designing communities in this way. And we've got quite a large ask as a result in front of the legislature for the 2023 session, and our budget pointed at this program specifically to help our local partners with implementation. So I'm also a little worried about what this implies about their effectiveness and their value. But I appreciate all your work, and I know there's many different moving parts on this. It's very hard to pull it all together. Thank you.
Agree.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Commissioner or Director Bateman. Couple of points. One is that all of these actions need to be implemented to achieve the target. So all of them need to go forward. What we're trying to do here is not degrade some of them, but to help decision makers with the struggle that they're going to have, which is that we cannot do all of these all at the same time and start them all at the same time. So how do you tier them so that you can give some direction through to decision makers about which ones should be the implemented first, second, and third? Having said that, while cost effectiveness is a criteria, it was only a part of the overall evaluation criteria. And in fact, the greenhouse gas emission reductions was weighted highest of all of them by the commission at 29 points, with cost effectiveness at half of that at 15. But the co-benefits, for instance, are another 45 points out of that. And what happens with the scoring is that those actions that are really high cost effective, because the commission chose to weight cost effectiveness relatively low compared to greenhouse gas emissions, the ones that are low in greenhouse gas emission amount reduced end up getting lower scores. And so, for instance, while those two actions were number 1 and number 3 in terms of cost effectiveness, on greenhouse gas emissions, they were 21 and 23, and overall score, they were 19 and 13th, and on co-benefits, 20th and 15th. So the way that the scoring system and evaluation of bringing all those things together, not just cost effectiveness, weighs weighted the scoring and had those two come in relatively lower on the ranking scale. Not to say that we're not going to do them, they just didn't score as high as the other things. The other thing is they're relatively low in terms of greenhouse gas emissions because they're not fully well understood how you actually do that, and also they were also limited in their scope, so they're not the broadest scope thing in terms of what you might think in both of those things, as you alluded to in your email earlier, but they're much more limited in terms of how much we're actually trying to get through that action. For instance, it's only 25%, I think, more density in urban areas, so the scope of those actions is smaller as well.
Right, just a final point on that. Certainly you get more effectiveness when you're building new. So this would be, perspective looking forward, of course. I don't know if it makes a difference or not, but I think, Chair, your point's a good one. If there's any way to asterisk or star the fact that these are, part of programs that are already underway, and just note that like I said, we're going to continue to move forward with these anyway. But if there's a way to bump them up just because they're already moving, we'd appreciate it. But we'll be satisfied either way. Thank you.
Director Bateman, thank you. And I'm still deciding how valuable it is to put these in tiers versus describe the different characteristics of the actions, and use it more as information that kind of goes in to help decision makers decide where to put effort, rather than necessarily just kind of going just by the numbers, but really thinking about the definition. Commissioner Jackson.
Yeah, I just want to provide some input. And Director Bateman, thank you so much for your comments. I think it kind of opened the door for me to kind of make sure that I recall well our last meeting and the discussion we had, because I recall that at the time of scoring, I know that, I gave cost effectiveness, a significant weight. I really stand by the fact that, we want to be focused on GHG reductions as our top priority, and then and tier them or list them in a way that's actionable. So I stand by that. But I do want to go back, because I want to make sure that in case I've rethought this, that I express this, especially in lieu of Director Bateman's comments. And by the way, Ellen, before I go to the next piece, as you were going through the different rankings, I was wondering how they overlap. So this graph here was like excellent. It's almost like you were thinking exactly what I was trying to do and you did it. So this actually helped me even flesh out my next comment. If we go back to the previous slide in which you actually lived, I think it's the previous slide, one more back, that one. And this is definitely for my fellow commissioners, is I do believe that we should start with the GHG reduction amount, and then, then we go next to cost effectiveness and co-benefits. I just want to say that kind of really thinking it through, taking off my previous public agency hat and really thinking about myself more as a commissioner and visionary, and kind of, making strong recommendations to our legislators, is that we should look stronger at the co-benefits versus cost effectiveness. I think it's through is cost effectiveness is important, but should that be our role? If we don't prioritize in this commission the GHGs and the co-benefits, no one else is. I'm sure there's a finance committee that's talking about cost effectiveness. I think we want to push and be much more proactive and visionary there, and put cost effectiveness, as much as it hurts me, lower down, because unless we're more aggressive and really look at how it impacts our communities and our people, so just kind of what Director Bateman was talking about, we're not going to prioritize getting grants and getting funding. So although old public hat, kind of irks at this, I do feel that as a commissioner, it's important for me to think about that this is all about the benefits to our community, our state, residents throughout the different areas, and that cost effectiveness needs to be prioritized in a different commission, in a different forum. So just my 2 cents in, and Alan, if that messes up your graph, I apologize, but I'd be remiss to continue down this road knowing that kind of now seeing it visually, it helps me really put this in perspective. So my 2 cents, and apologies if that messes, but definitely I'm only one voice. I want to make sure that my fellow commissioners have their input as well.
I see a number of hands up. I'm not sure of the order, but I'll go to Commissioner Apter first.
Thank you. Yeah, I just want to strongly echo Commissioner Jackson's statement. I really appreciate you raising that, and very much agree. I think, especially given some of the conversation we've had just this morning, but also in past meetings around cost effectiveness, it's also increasingly challenging to capture that in a way that fully reflects, potential cost of inaction, costs of climate impacts that we're experiencing now. I think the 6th climate assessment that was referenced earlier this morning is a perfect example of that. And I just want to make sure that Commissioner Jackson's comments are uplifted, and that we are prioritizing greenhouse gas reduction amount and cost benefits over cost effectiveness for those and other reasons, as we've discussed in past meetings.
Thank you, Commissioner Apter. Commissioner Magnera.
Yes, I also just want to echo Commissioner Jackson's comments. I think I've said this before in other meetings, but cost effectiveness tests often do not sufficiently account for community benefit and some of the cost savings that can come to communities related to healthcare costs, related to other kinds of cost benefits within the community. And so that disconnect, I think it's important to rate the co-benefits piece certainly higher than cost effectiveness. And I think there are other elements in the scale that could be valued more than cost effectiveness as well, because it is such an imperfect way to assess like the holistic benefit of a particular action.
Thank you, Commissioner Magnera. Commissioner Ford.
Yeah, good morning. Yeah, thank you. When I read the materials, unfortunately I wasn't able to participate in the last meeting in December, but I did go back and listen to the recordings, which I thought was quite useful. I guess I have a slightly different perspective. I do think, as we've ranked these, the cost effectiveness should be as part of this criteria, and we should maintain some level of cost effectiveness criteria here, which we agreed to before. So, I want to push back a little bit and say we do have limited funds, and I think how we recommend actions, because I think we're going to be recommending all these actions, which I support, by the way, but I do think we do need to provide the information we do have on cost effectiveness to the legislature, and not because I think it's a full package, and then how they decide they want to utilize that information is up to the legislature. But I do think it's incumbent upon us to acknowledge that certain actions are much more expensive and are not going to get us as far down the road. So I do think it needs to be part of this discussion going forward. But I agree that GHG reduction is the highest priority, and I think we've ranked it that way on purpose as a commission. And so, we ranked co-benefits slightly higher than cost effectiveness, which I was fine with, but I don't think we should be de-emphasizing cost effectiveness either in our recommendations. So that's my thought.
Thank you, Commissioner Ford. Any other? Gabriella, you had your hand up. Would you like to weigh in?
I think there were several more voices that were raised in support of the approach that Commissioner Bateman and Jackson were articulated so well. And just recalling the discussion of this commission about the importance of the narrative, to flag and to call for the resources that the commission would need to be able to strengthen the analytical underpinnings in these areas where there is uncertainty, and using the cost effectiveness information that we do have tends to undermine some of the priorities. And can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, but this commission also has the choice of how to present this information. So thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to suggest we go ahead and have Alan finish his presentation, and then we can come back to this topic.
We are going to look at all of these different things. So just a couple of comments. Again, Zach, go back to that graphic. We must do all of the actions to meet the accelerated goal. So it's not as if we're choosing to not do one versus the other. That's not the point here. The point here is, with limited resources, as Commissioner Reitman said, what party should we send as a signal about which ones we need to focus on? And as Manny said, the focus is on greenhouse gas reduction amount, getting the biggest impact. I would also point out that this is just that small sliver. If you recall back to the slides in previous meetings, the wedge diagrams, the biggest part of meeting the 2035 goal is that business's plan scenario with the 15 programs, including HB 2021 and the CPP, that reduced all those. Those are the primary drivers of getting here. This is just a smaller wedge, like 7 million out of 35 million metric tons reduced in overall programmatic issues to get to the greenhouse gas reductions that we have. So this is a small sliver of that larger piece of the pie. And I would point out that the greenhouse gas reduction amounts and co-benefits are already emphasized in this analysis pretty dramatically, especially in the evaluation criteria scoring and ranking process. The cost effectiveness out of 100 points is only 15. Commission actually reduced that from the recommended suggested 20 points at the beginning. And so that's 15 points for that, 29 points for greenhouse gas emissions, 45 for all of the co-benefits. So 3/4 of the analysis and the scoring is related to the greenhouse gas reduction amounts and the co-benefits, and only 15% is related to cost effectiveness. So I would say that you accomplished what you are saying in the way that you weighted these and the way that the analysis ended up working out. And so the scoring and ranking is actually intended to be a more holistic approach that looked at all of those different factors and weighted them. And in this instance, it did derate or did put cost effectiveness on as one of the lower evaluated criteria. I would, though, have a bit of a caution. Commissioner Reitman, I think, is correct. We have already received comments that the commission's ranking has put cost effectiveness as too low. And for those people that think that this plan should be based only on cost effectiveness, they're going to look at this recommendation and the ranking recommendation and the narrative around that as cost effectiveness is less important to the commission, and that may impact the credibility of the recommendation that you put forward. I fully understand the need to position this because there's a whole bunch of people just want to do cost effectiveness, but just a word of caution in your discussion and deliberation and how you want to do this. And then finally, in the end, we'll have a recommendation about how this all plays together in terms of tiers 1, 2, and 3. And it's up to the commission voting members to decide whether or not that's correct. So where we left off was, were there any of the cost effectiveness, do any of the most cost effective ones, actions merit moving from up in tiers, and the one we thought was food waste. Next slide, please, Zach. When we looked at co-benefits only, you'll notice that when we did the co-benefits, a lot of the high greenhouse gas reduction actions were actually ranked in the top 10 of co-benefits only. Remember, this is just the 45 points associated with equity, health, and jobs and economic prosperity. So, and then the three other ones were in tier 2, and then the 7th and 8th co-benefit ranking ones were the least or the lowest in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So because of that fact, number 7 and 8, we didn't feel like they should jump up into tier 2 because they are such a low amount of greenhouse gas emissions associated with them. So because of the co-benefits ranking, it pretty much sticks with the original tiering. And so we didn't suggest any changes or recommend any changes to the tiering based on cost effectiveness. Next slide, please.
Didn't you mean based on co-benefits?
I'm based on cost. Yeah, I think we're cost effectiveness centric. Yes, based on co-benefits. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
And the next slide is we did look at the tiers based on overall the holistic approach, as Commissioner Apter said, on the overall score evaluation criteria scoring, and we put in the top 10 in that are the numbers above the bars again, and it's not surprisingly you weighted greenhouse gas emission reductions as a high part of the scoring, and of the top tier 1, you saw most of them were in the top 10. 2 of them were in the top in tier 2, and then the 9th one, which was food waste program, was the 9th most highest scoring one, and the rest of them were not in the top 10. And so the recommendation that we had, that one that stands out, is moving again, having food waste move from tier 3 into tier 2. Next graph, please, Zach. Then we looked at federal funding. So we don't know what the federal funding is exactly for all of these things. It's still very much in flux and very much still being determined by U.S. Department of Energy. And so we can't apply specific numbers in the graph. And beside that, while we were doing the scoring and ranking is when the IRA passed in Congress. And so it was pretty 11:59 in terms of the timing of that information. And yet, even if we did try to do that, we don't know how to apply those to determine the cost effectiveness change in some of these things, or implementation dollars. But what we did then look at was, of the actions that we have identified in this analysis, which ones of them have the potential to have federal funding. And we noted those by the dollar symbols above the bars. And what we mean by federal funding is there's kind of 2 parts to the federal funding in IRA. There's the tax credits, which are individuals can get a tax credit if they do this certain action. So that could affect a lot of these actions. Or there's a direct programmatic funding. So like the Homes in Here, $113 million is for the first 2 is direct funding to do weatherization, both in commercial and residential, and also rooftop solar for some of the greenhouse gas reduction amounts. So if it had tax credits or direct funding, we put a $sign above it. What's notable is that almost all of them have federal funding available to them, and so there's a couple of notable exceptions, and in the memo we talk about why they're not being funded, but and 2 of them being the reduced floor area and higher residential density. We didn't see how there was a direct federal funding for either of those. at this point. And so with that, there wasn't much change in terms of federal funding impacting our tiering, except for food waste, which we thought should move up from tier 3 into tier 2. Next slide, please, Zach. And so finally, what we did was we looked at risk and uncertainty and scored those. Those numbers of the of risk and uncertainty showed up as numbers above the bars. There were a lot of ties. So there was clear 1 and clear 2, and then I think there were 6 or 7 programs that were actually tied at 3, and then it jumps down to like 9 or jumps to 10. So the top 10 are listed here, but there's a bunch of 3s because they're all tied in terms of their score. So again, we didn't feel like this analysis, and this wasn't one of the ones that the commission recommended using to do prioritization. So we didn't feel there were any changes to the recommended tiering based on this analysis. Next slide, please. So this slide actually shows the all of the actions in electrification scenario, and in rank order by greenhouse gas emission reduction amount. So the very first one. So it shows the tiering that we said in that graphic: tier 1, 2, and 3. Tier 1 is the ones that are highlighted in green. Tier 2 are the ones highlighted in blue, and tier 3 are the ones that are white. And this graph does reflect moving the food waste program as recommended from tier 3 into tier 2, that otherwise be a white colored action. And then the other one that is recommended moving tier 2 is the energy storage increase of 25%. And that is because of the fact that we already have an operating program that Odo operates, the solar plus storage program, that currently gives incentives for people to do residential storage. And so that would be easily bundled with the rooftop solar action, which is number 2 on the list, because it already exists. So the ease of doing that one and the fact that we already do it means it's already being implemented. We don't have to do a whole lot. Made that recommendation go from tier 3 to tier 2. Finally, I just point out that there are on the little table to the right by action category. Most of the actions that are in this list are energy efficiency, 16 out of 27, so more than half. 14 are building energy efficiency, 6 are related to transportation, 4 are related to renewable energy, 2 more are industrial energy efficiency, and 1 is related to waste, the food waste program. And then one more slide, Zach. There are also several of these actions that merit further study before they can be fully implemented. We already know how to do a lot of this stuff. We know how to do weatherization. We know how to do rooftop solar. We know how to do energy storage in residential sectors. So there are a lot of these actions can easily slide into an existing program where we already know the pathway, we already know the delivery mechanism, and they exist. So a lot of those move forward. But there are several in here that need more development before we can develop the action plan to get them towards implementation. And these actions either don't have an existing pathway, or their delivery mechanism or technology is not as certain or is underdeveloped. And so those actions need to be made a high priority in terms of development towards getting to an action implementation plan. And they're listed here as it relates to tier 2 and tier 3 actions. And those, and as part of the recommendations that we'll be doing in the later part of the meeting, recommendation 5A for additional global warming staffing. Part of what they would do is to actually figure this out a little bit more so they can get towards an action implementation plan and be able to move them forward. Similarly, there's a couple of these that we had that we didn't have sufficient information on at all to even score and rank, and those were the industrial electrification action and making transit buses all EV by 2035 and 50% of off-road vehicles all be EVs by 2035. We just didn't have enough information. Those also would be in this grouping.
Alan, to go back
With
to
that,
Director Bateman's point.
Yeah, I just wanted to explain. We could go through this analysis again for all of the electrification stuff, and we can do that with more brevity, but we can do that after or before this conversation we're about to have on
Yeah, I just
these.
wanted to point out, you've got reduced residential floor area and higher urban density as needing more study. And yet that sounds a lot like the climate friendly communities. I know I'm not getting the name of that program right, but considerable effort has gone into thinking that through. So I guess I question why those would be things that take more study, but would leave that open to Director Bateman. And then same thing with congestion pricing. The ODOT is doing some additional study that they're going to be doing over the next year to help design that or finish the design. So maybe it's fair to leave it there, but it's well underway. 5 years into the program at this point.
Right, and talking to the folks on the last point, talking to folks at ODOT, congestion pricing has had a lot of work in thinking about it. An actual pathway to deliver it and putting it in place is not there, so that is something that they're going to be working on quite a bit. And the program you're referring to, Climate and Friendly Equitable Communities, CFEC, if you like acronyms, is something that the DLC or LCDC put forward and put those goals and rules forward to communities. I know as a city councilor in Eugene, we've got those sent to us, and they landed with a big question mark that we don't know at the local level how to actually implement that. There's a lot of study. Just for Eugene, the estimate was it would cost $1 million just to figure out how to implement that rule, and it will take probably a couple of years. So there's still, and that's exactly what this is saying. Those things need to be fleshed out more before they can be actual action implementation plans that can be delivered and that can deliver greenhouse gas reductions.
Director Bateman, do you want to respond?
Yes, our staff is happy to I think we'll collaborate and work with you on that. We certainly have the guidance and the resources here available to work with our local government partners in implementation and make sure they've got the resources and the information they need to move forward.
Thank you, Director Bateman. And just want to emphasize again that, we have not gotten state agency review of this work. And so I think making sure that we get good review from the state agencies to make sure we're making the right assumptions, I think will be really important.
And again, this is the reveal of the recommendation with public comment and commissioner comment over the next couple of weeks. I think, Zach, it's through the 25th of January, and then we'll be coming back on the 3rd at the next commission meeting to adopt these recommendations or modify them as the commission sees fit.
Do you have more to present?
Yeah, I'll run through these a lot quicker because the explanation, we've already gone through it. So the next slide, please, Zach. So when you look at the hybrid scenario, next slide, please. Here's the tierings, tier 1, 2, and 3. These are different set. There's 5 actions that go away that were in the electrification scenario, and 4 were added different that are unique to the hybrid scenario. And those actions are the RNG and the industrial renewable hydrogen use, and the injection of renewable hydrogen into the pipeline, and then using fuel cells, 5% fuel cells by 2030, very ambitious goal. And those were the 4 unique actions in the hybrid scenario, and they're colored here in purple. And they're in terms of greenhouse gas emission reduction amounts, those fit within 2 of them fit within tier 1 and 2 of them fit within tier 2. Next slide, please, Zach. When we did the analysis, and we'll run through these quickly, when we did it by cost effectiveness, they kind of moved to the lower end of the cost effectiveness scale. Next slide, please. When we did the co-benefits only analysis, they ended up moving to the lower side of the co-benefits scale or ranking. Next slide, please. When we did the evaluation criteria, it was a little bit more of a mixed bag in terms of where they landed, with 2 of the higher ones, because they have high greenhouse gas emission reduction amounts, being in tier 1, and two of them being in tier 3. So next slide, please, Zach. And the next 2, please. Oh, sorry, don't. The next one. That and risk and uncertainty, same. They kind of mixed bag in terms of where they landed. So next slide, please, Zach. So then we developed the prioritization recommendation, and next slide, please. And when we looked at, again, this tiering of these 3 tiers, and now we're only looking at the purple bars. We're assuming in this analysis that the electrification scenario prioritization of all the common actions stays the same. We're only looking at whether or not any of these purple bars should move up or down into different tiers. So when we look at the next chart, we looked at cost effectiveness, and what we saw was that these were indeed not highly cost effective. 18th and 16th in terms of cost effectiveness, 17th and 14th. And so the recommendation here is to, because of those cost effectiveness rankings, to move them down, the first 2 into tier 2 and the other 2 into tier 3. So RNG and industrial hydrogen into 2 and 3, and injection, 15% injection, and fuel cells into tier 3. Next slide, please. When we looked at just the co-benefits analysis, the same thing happened. They were ranked 21st and 17th and 19th and 14th. Again, the recommendation is shifting them from tier 1 into those 2 into tier 1 and the other 2 into tier 3. Next slide, please. When we looked at,
you mean to say the first 2 into tier 2?
And the second 2 into tier 3. Okay. Same with evaluation criteria. With regard to the lower 2, they were ranked relatively low and moving them to tier 3, but the evaluation score actually kept the other 2, RNG and industrial renewable hydrogen, as high priority ones. Next slide, please. When we looked at federal funding that would be available, all of them had federal funding that would be available. So that didn't result in making us make any recommendations about whether or not they should shift in terms of tiers. And then finally, risk and uncertainty. We looked at, again, the two of the lowest ranking risk and uncertainty, ones with the highest risk and uncertainty, because we just don't know. Either the technology is not there, or we're uncertain how it's actually going to get done. Moving those 2 actions, unique actions of the hybrid scenario, from tier 2 into tier 3. So the summary of all of that analysis, next slide, please, is again this chart of what's in tier 1, 2, and 3. Again, the green actions are highlighted. Tier 1 are in green. They're highlighted here in green. And Tier 2 is blue, and Tier 3 is white. So this reflects the movement of the recommendations of the other analysis of the RNG and the industrial renewable hydrogen into Tier 2, so making them go from green to blue, and the renewable hydrogen injection of 15% by 2035 and home fuel cells 5% by 2030, shifting them from blue to white from Tier 2 to Tier 3. Finally, the categories are there to the left. Again, 14 of 25 are energy efficiency, 6 transportation, 3 hydrogen, and 1 RNG, and 1 waste. And then finally, last 2 slides, again, there's quite a few of these that do not have existing delivery pathways, or their mechanism for delivery or technology is uncertain. And so they merit more study before we can develop action implementation plans. So we wanted to pull those out and make sure that they were fully understood. Of course, that would take more staff time to be able to do that. So it's linked to the recommendation that you'll see about increasing Oregon Global Warming staffing. I don't know how these would get more fleshed out in a timely fashion without that staffing pushing it on a lot of these. And again, the ones that are unique to the hybrid scenario are bolded and in italics. The 2 that are in here, they both need more analysis and study and how to get them to be able to create an action implementation plan. And then there's some in Tier 3. Next slide, please, Zach. The 2 are in Tier 3, and they need more analysis as well before they can be fully implemented. And then my final last slide is that many of you know that the legislature put together a resilient and efficient building task force, the rebuilding task force. They came out with their recommendations last month, and these are their recommendations that they had, and you can see how much support they had. They're rank ordered in terms of the support level. But what's important here is that their recommendations are wholly consistent with the recommendations that we're making in the TIGR process, that they emphasize promoting and incentivizing energy efficiency in heat pumps. So does the actions that we have, and that they improve codes, and that is a high priority action on our part as well. So our recommendations are consistent with what this group just came up with and forwarded to the legislature. So there's no inconsistencies here. And that's the end of our presentation, Chair.
Thank you, Alan. Any questions for Alan and or comments on how we follow-up comments on how we think about all of this information as we work to finish the roadmap?
Oh, I'm sorry. One more thing, Chair. So I didn't put a slide in there, but in the end, as I started, I don't want to bury the lead, so I started with the recommendation. The recommendation is that all the tiering that we came up with for the electrification scenario would all move forward in those tiers, and the 4 unique hybrid would also move forward, but in their respective tiers as recommended in Tiers 2 and Tier 3. So all of the recommendations, all 31 of them, would be moved forward towards trying to figure them out and implement them better.
So Alan, maybe just to interpret, one of the things that the commission has discussed is whether or not we wanted to pick one or the other scenario that we modeled, or if we should, move all the actions forward in one form or fashion. And so that's what Alan is referring to, is that the staff is recommending that we move all of the actions that we identified forward, either, something that needs more study, or, a high Tier 1, 2, or 3 priority So that's one question is, are we comfortable moving all of those actions forward? And then secondly, how are we feeling about how we would be describing the benefits of the actions and putting them in tiers? So any comments on either the proposal from staff to move all the actions forward, or comments on further reflection on how the scoring worked?
Yeah, just one further comment on that. So originally we thought that when we would do this analysis, that the hybrid and the electrification scenario would be significantly different. In fact, the hybrid was actually initially called alternative fuels scenario, but what we found was there wasn't enough in alternative fuels to actually create a scenario unto itself. So we had to borrow a lot of the actions from the electrification to actually meet the goal in the hybrid scenario. So there was that big overlap between the two scenarios. 18 programs were common to both, and there were 5 that were different in the hybrid and 7 that were unique to the electrification. And so all of those, and then we thought about, we might have a conversation, but we did not have a conversation with the council about which pathway would be preferred over the other. So without that conversation, which I think would be a pretty big conversation, are at this point, and we can have that conversation in the future. At this point, to move this forward, we felt like all of the actions that have been proposed should be moving forward into the next phase of trying to figure out how to create action implementation plans.
But we can talk about that assumption now.
Yeah, that was
Commissioner Magnera. And then, Zach, do you want to just add a clarification, and then if that's what you put your hand up to do?
Yeah, thanks, Chair McDonald. I just wanted to add that so we'll get into this in the recommendations discussion that'll come later, but part of the overall recommendation on these is also to continue to do public engagement on these actions. There's a lot of conversation as we were going through the co-benefits analysis and the scoring that, we could only do what we could do with the resources that we had. And so there is also a recommendation to have some more public engagement on these items to help in designing the implementation, and also trying to figure out whether, going one scenario or the other scenario is better or not. We don't have enough information at the moment. And so one of the recommendations later that we'll talk about is also trying to have, recommending that ODO do a state energy system planning effort to try to get at some of those issues. So just want to provide a little more holistic context about how we're thinking about how they work together.
Thank you, Zach. Commissioner Magnera.
Yeah, it's just a reflection on the activities that reached or that made the cut, which is that they're, for the most part, from a co-benefits perspective, going to serve more urban or developed areas. And I know we've got the natural and working lands work that's happening, and that in general, where most of our emissions reductions are needed are in more urban areas. But that might be something worth noting for the report. Just thinking from a political perspective, that there are a lot of legislators who may not see their communities in this work. So I think it's important for this body to help communicate that, or to help explain why there are fewer recommendations that might be specific to rural communities. And of course, the existing buildings piece will have a very big benefit, especially heat pumps for communities that are very dependent on bulk fuels. But nonetheless, I think that is something that stands out to me, and that may stand out to other legislators, and that we should anticipate in kind of how this gets conveyed and messaged.
Really good point. I think we've talked about trying to show some of the county results too, and maybe help people see where this is going to touch down and not. So, or where the different actions do. So we'll both include narrative and maybe use some of the county-based information to help illustrate potential benefits across the state, but also, where some may vary.
Just a comment on that. That's totally true what Commissioner Magnera said about the transportation ones, but almost all of the energy efficiency ones are 100% of households by 2033 will have heat pumps or heat pump water heaters, or an increased weatherization and increase the residential commercial building codes, which would be statewide. So all of those affect everyone in the state. And I think I've often said that the one way to deal with the issue of equity in terms of rural and low income, moderate income is make sure that you do the low income and moderate income first and the rural folks first, because they always end up getting the short end of the stick. And so, but that's related to how they get implemented, not what, because these are all 100% of homes will get heat pumps, for instance.
I appreciate that you raised that point, but at least living in a rural community and talking to my community about some of the work that the state does, even if you say 100%, people don't always see themselves in that. So I think being really explicit about it, or saying in implementation, we can really prioritize communities, like that's really important to name, because I think while it may feel inherent or implied to those of us on this body, it's not in a community like Lakeview. And like being really explicit that this means you is something that I found in my work I have to go out of my way to do, and would encourage this body to do the same.
Yeah, it certainly could be something we put in the as a recommendation in the report for sure.
Any feedback on the staff recommendation about moving forward with all the actions in one form or another, or kind of other thoughts about the rankings and how we should be thinking about it?
Zach, you want to bring up like slide 17, kind of summary slide?
Not seeing any hands. I guess the two things from my perspective is really wanting to make sure that for things that are underway, we maybe call those out, like we did the two actions that were still in rulemaking when we were doing the scenario modeling, but potentially thinking about characterizing some of the things that are already underway a little differently. So that's I guess one of my concerns. And then the second is I think we do need to kind of provide, here's one cut at setting priorities. We tried to look at co-benefits. There may be other co-benefits that weren't included in our analysis that may be a really important reason for us, for a legislator or an agency to move something forward. For example, on the congestion pricing, just the huge impact that has on getting goods to market and back. So I think we should make sure we're not setting this up to be a rationale not to do things, and really trying to think about how we can help the state think about this in a holistic way. Commissioner Jackson? I think you must be muted. You don't look like you are, but.
Okay, sorry. Okay, there we go. I want to support the staff's recommendation for how to present it to move all the actions forward. I think as commissioners, we may have specific preferences, but I think the way the staff's put it together, it's much more of information. And I think speaks to your point about being useful and in a way to inform. I also want to support Commissioner McNamara's recommendation about adding that information. I think putting forward the recommendation to do all of the items and making it as informational as we can, it can actually move things forward versus us being prescriptive. So although we may have individual preference, as I do, I think not being prescriptive is the path forward to success and actually getting things done. So I just want to support the staff, the way they've recommended it to move forward.
Great. Thank you, Commissioner Jackson. Commissioner Ford.
Thank you, Chair McDonald. I also support the recommendations as they've been laid out. And I agree with Commissioner Jackson's perspective on this, that I think we have to be careful not to be prescriptive. I think putting all these items out onto the playing field is the appropriate thing to do, and provide as much information as we can to the legislators and to the agencies as they're looking at creating legislation and/or programs within their various agencies. I am a little concerned about the tiered approach. I think, Chair, you'd mentioned this earlier. Not that I don't think they ought to be priorities, but I think we can list the priorities by 1 to 27 or whatever. I'm just concerned that from a reader's perspective, I just psychologically would probably dismiss tier 3 stuff and focus on tier 1 and maybe some tier 2, and not really give the appropriate due diligence or evaluation of things that are in tier 3. So if the concept is that we're going to recommend all these actions and provide the information to support these actions, I'm a little concerned that organizing them by tiers may prejudice the readers a bit, and we're already putting them in priority by 1 through 27. So that's just a quick thought I have after reading those materials and thinking about this a bit. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Ford. Commissioner Potowski.
Thank you, Commissioner McDonald, Chair McDonald, I mean. I was just a side comment on your comments about congestion pricing. And I think this relates to some of the other actions that are on here. Congestion pricing has a lot of benefits in terms of making our road system more efficient. It means ODOT doesn't have to spend as much on building new roads. And it also provides funding for roads. So those are things that are maybe somewhat not related to reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, but that's also one of the items that it helps with. So if we're just explicit about it and saying, just because it may be in this lower tier 3, it's not something that we say we shouldn't do, because there's lots of other things that it can do that are useful. And I think that's a kind of a comment that maybe on some of the other items you could also make. Thank you.
Yeah, agreed, Commissioner Potowski. Other commissioners that want to weigh in? Zach, how are we doing on time?
We are actually right on time. We were going to take a break, I believe, around 10:30, so pretty close.
Great. Commissioner Sharon, did you want to weigh in?
Just wanted to thank staff for putting all this information together. I'm supportive of the proposal and the information that's going forward to decision makers.
Great. Thank you, Commissioner Sharon. Yeah, the staff have been working really hard, nights and weekends, to get all of this work done. Director Benner.
I also appreciate all the work and think this is a good approach overall. I did want to just acknowledge the issues that Director Bateman raised and confess that I had some similar questions about the accuracy and strength of the modeling that showed something, the actions that were in the climate-friendly communities being so low on the greenhouse gas reduction side. And we might want to just take a little bit of time after this before we move further in finalizing to circle back with DLCD staff, and if not, figure out a way. It may not be possible to, at this point, adjust the rankings, but at least figure out a way to communicate the limits of the models and the metrics as it relates to those types of actions. Because I agree with the comments that were made earlier. When you look at this list, you definitely think some are better than others based on kind of a limited way of measuring them. And I would hate for this report to somehow give the impression that those are not very, very valuable activities to pursue. And I also think we're going to have an opportunity to pursue federal funding for many of these provisions, not necessarily just the ones that are highlighted in specific programs, but if we're able to show the US EPA that these particular actions reduce greenhouse gas emissions, there's funding under the IRA for that. And I think, climate friendly communities should be front and central to any proposal we share with the federal government. So I just wanted to acknowledge that, and I look forward to working with Director Bateman and the DLCD staff to make sure that this report just accurately gives credit to those types of actions.
Absolutely. And not to mention the benefits from avoided emissions from the land sector by having more compact communities, which wasn't considered in the greenhouse gas benefits here. So great. Well, we are scheduled to take a break. We will, as we discussed earlier, all of this plus what we're going to hear from Zach about will be open for public input through the 25th. So more things to come. Excuse me. Yeah.
Yeah, totally heard the psychological impacts of tiering, and we'll take that to heart when the recommendation gets written. And again, as Commissioner Potowski said, it's not should we do these, they're all important. I'll just also point out that we started with 120 plus actions and narrowed down this to 31 that are in the top tier of actions in that grander scheme of things. So all those other ones that didn't make it into the list need to be emphasized that this is kind of the cream of the crop, and we're trying to kind of nitpick prioritization based on greenhouse gas emission reductions in this tiering scheme. Not that we shouldn't do them, but that we can't do all of them at once. Heard that.
Yeah, I think if we can also, when we're describing the actions, kind of say where they are in the process. And who needs to make the next decision? Is it a legislative action that's needed, executive branch, both? I think it would be helpful if we were characterizing kind of what we think the next actions should look like. And with that, are we scheduled for a 10-minute break? Or 15, Zach? Apologies.
I think we have 15, but
we're a little behind now. Okay, well, let's try and be back at 10 to 11, 10:50. Then we're 5 behind, but we should be okay, I think. Thank you.
Made a really substantive in the sense that the whole recommendations are truly the same. So it's supporting and continuing implementation of the existing climate program, adopt updated state greenhouse gas reduction goals, advance a set of additional climate actions that can help the state meet an accelerated 2030 goal, fund future studies to continue to guide climate action over time, and strengthen governance and accountability for Oregon climate action, and then finally to position the state to take full advantage of federal investments in climate action. And I see just on the first recommendation, it's the regulations adopted and under development was what we were using to categorize the recommendation, the actions that were studied under the TIGR analysis to see that we were on track to meet our goals. And that should just be, it should now just say adopted programs. And we were going back and forth about whether to say existing or adopted. And that's my fault that it should just say existing climate programs here. But the same recommendation is what is moving forward. So this is an original outline of the draft recommendations from when we put those out back in November. There were a lot of sub-recommendations under those 6 overarching strategies that are summarized here. There, again, was a lot of good conversation around both with the commission and public comments that then led us to make a number of changes. And I'll try to walk us through those changes as we go. At the high level summary of the changes are that we fully detailed the recommendation language out, which was the plan, but it's now close to 20 pages. So there's a lot in there. All of the prior sub-recommendations in the outline that I just had up there were kept, and they will appear in normal text in the slides that follow. And then there were some sub-recommendations that got consolidated into each other, and I'll note that where that happened. And then there's multiple new sub-recommendations, and you'll see the green language in slides that follow to reflect those. And then because there was some consolidation and some multiple new sub-recommendations, we did some administrative relettering of the sub-recommendations as needed to make it all work together. So on the first recommendation, there was a lot of good conversation about existing climate programs that the state has and the importance of highlighting that those existing climate programs, the ones that were analyzed as part of the specific ones that were analyzed as part of the programs and regulations adopted and under development, as well as those that weren't, need to be supported with staffing and resources and need to be implemented and operate as planned. And one example of a program which we've talked about this morning already is DLCD's Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities program, which was not included in the analysis of the PROD scenario programs and regulations adopted and under development because it was still under, it was not yet established. And so we were also, as the analysis was going, we weren't able to go back and redo the analysis with that in it. And so that is an example of why this recommendation is broader than just the specific programs that are in, that were analyzed via TIGR analysis. And then there was a lot of good conversation during commission meetings over the past couple of months about this particular recommendation and making it clear that many existing programs also potentially need complementary programs and incentives and other items that can help that maximize the implementation of those programs. So we put in a sub-recommendation related to that to make it clear that there may need to be more action to help support existing climate programs. So we can't just rest on our laurels of saying, well, we have these programs in place and they'll be fine. There's more work that can be done to help facilitate and accelerate those programs. And then we also included a sub-recommendation on ensuring equitable implementation of existing climate programs and regulations. And this was to get at the fact that there is a lot of direction in many of the existing climate programs to address equity and prioritize environmental justice communities, but it's still an evolving body of work and implementation effort around prioritizing environmental justice communities that there's a lot still more to learn and to do. And so want to make it clear that it is very important for the existing climate programs also to achieve the aims that have been set out for them to deliver benefits to environmental justice communities. So let me say that I basically just took the titles of each of the sub-recommendations and put them here. There's paragraphs that support these and talk about what I'm adding to some of these. So just so you all know, that I would encourage you to read the justification for these sub-recommendations, and we would welcome comments to help support the problem statement or justifications that we've put in to support these. So moving on to recommendation 2. Recommendation 2 is around the updating the state's greenhouse gas emission reduction goals. And we're going to talk a bit more about this as we later on, after I go through all the other recommendations, and I've highlighted a couple of changes based on commission discussion at the last meeting. But I'm not going to talk about those. I don't want us to have a discussion about those at the moment, just because it takes a little bit deeper dive to do that. So these, at the high level, these 4 recommendations, sub-recommendations, are the ones that when staff presented follow-up, the requested follow-up at the last meeting on the greenhouse gas goals questions, these were the 4 recommendations that we put forward with a little bit more detail and some slight changes. So first, that basically establishing that it's the policy of the state to pursue action at a level and pace that's consistent with pathways to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Then updating Oregon's statutory sector-based greenhouse gas emission reduction goals to align with that limit. And the commission, after good discussion at the last meeting, centered in on recommending the accelerated goal that was considered in part of the TIGR analysis. So moving the Executive Order 2004 goal in 2035 goal to 2030 of at least 45% below 1990 levels. And then the commission felt it was important to, because of moving that goal, there would be a gap between 2030 and 2050, and the commission felt it was important to have another interim target there, and the commission had centered on 70% below 1990 levels by 2040, both because that kind of tracks the TIGR analysis projections, as well as is consistent with Washington State's, our neighbor to the north goal. And then there's a little bit of conversation and some remaining questions around where to set the 2050 goal. And so we talked about a 90 or 95% goal, and that's why that's highlighted here, because we would like to talk a little bit more about that. So after, so we'll talk about that after I get through the rest of these recommendations. the sub-recommendation, the next sub-recommendation was to set a goal to achieve net zero emissions as soon as practicable and no later than 2050. And this is a bit of a change from what we had suggested in the prior meeting and our memo. We had suggested just directing the commission to study and recommend a net zero goal. And there were some comments at the meeting, and then also taking another look through other state goals. There are a lot of states that have set the goals. The commission has done a good analysis on the potential for carbon sequestration on national working lands. And so we were suggesting moving, actually having the legislature set a goal, a net zero emissions goal, but then also directing the Global Warming Commission to help develop a plan to meet that goal. And then lastly, we wanted to try to figure out how to ensure that the greenhouse gas emission reduction goals can be updated, periodically updated based on best available science. And we had left that recommendation kind of open at the last meeting, and we continue to do some thinking on it. And the challenge that we ran into is that so in Washington State, the legislature actually directs the Department of Ecology to do an analysis. So it directs a certain state agency to do an analysis of the science around the emissions and then provide a report. And we, DEQ does an inventory of our emissions here in Oregon. The Global Warming Commission has kind of been the one that has done the look. We have the Oregon Climate Change Research Institute. So those that does the true scientific assessment of what the impacts are on climate. And so we struggled with if we were to pick an agency, which agency. So we ended up just sticking with the Global Warming Commission and just trying to make it clear that the commission create a pathway for the commission to be able to have the discussion with the legislature. So the commission would conduct a periodic evaluation of the goals, and then they would recommend updated goals to the legislature, and that would be directed in statute, ideally, based on this recommendation. So that there's an obvious pathway, because right now it's a little bit unclear how to do that. The commission has tried in the past to put out a recommendation to improve the goals, but it hasn't. It took a while for that recommendation to get uptake, and it's still also not in statute. And again, we'll come back.
In the broader text, there's a trigger that's proposed that would cause the commission to do that. Correct?
Say that again. Sorry, Chair.
You've got a trigger mechanism for the commission to act to update the goals, and that trigger is tied to best available science and when new science comes out.
Yeah, thank you. It's the trigger would be national or international climate assessments that come out. The commission would need to provide a report to the legislature within 18 months of release of that new scientific report, assessing and evaluating the goals based on the new science and recommending any updates to the goals as needed. Awesome. So then I won't spend a ton of time here because we just spent earlier this morning talking about the recommendations for the new actions, but I I think this helps kind of put together how we were thinking about it, and the sub-recommendation C, I think, gets at a number of commissioner comments. First, the first recommendation, advance all the actions. And I just want to point out that we said in this as a guide, right? And I think that was getting at some of what folks were talking about earlier about, you know, the idea that we did the best we could here, and these this tiering and the like is, you know, in a type of guide to inform conversation and action, and there might be reasons to do one action quicker than another based on what we did. It's our analysis at a point in time. And then at the same time, there will be action and implementation planning around each of the actions to try to help figure out how to best move those actions forward. Sub-recommendation B, we already talked, they're prioritizing further study of a subset of the recommendations. And then the third one I want to spend a little bit of time on, just recognizing some of the conversation that the commission had around the co-benefits analysis and the scoring. There was general agreement that if we were to move forward the TIGR actions, that there needed to be more an effort around public engagement to try to, particularly with environmental justice communities, to try to inform the development of these actions and implementation of these actions. There were limits to what we could study as part of the co-benefits analysis based on just the level of grant funding that we had and also the technical capabilities. And so this recommendation is getting at the idea that we would want to have more engagement around these actions moving forward and how best to implement them, and get at the who. So we got at the what actions, and we want to be able to get at the how and who will benefit from the actions and be prioritized as part of those actions. So this recommendation is really getting at that, and hoping that based on that effort that we would be able to learn from this engagement effort and inform best practices for future roadmaps, so that environmental justice communities are participating and centered in the process from the start. So moving on to the fourth recommendation. Oh, sorry, one other point on this, on sub-recommendation C, there was some conversation this morning about county level data and, you know, potentially being able to help have conversations about how to better inform and maybe communicate how the actions are benefiting certain geographic areas and the like. And so in the description of this sub-recommendation, we talk about the idea that we could use the county data as a way to start a conversation about that, as well as using the co-benefits data that we have, and as a starting point to say, like, hey, does this stuff make sense, and how we've assumed that the benefits would occur here. And so there will also be, hopefully coming soon, the environmental justice mapping tool that's required under to be developed under HB 4077. So there will be a lot more information coming that can help us further refine and inform the implementation work ahead on these actions. Okay, so recommendation 4. There were a lot of things that we identified that we need to continue to do future studies. We need to do future studies on to help inform climate action moving forward, beyond just the actions that we identified. So first, we've only been able to really have the conversation, the rich conversation that we've had over the last couple of months. And I know that before I started, the commission was discussing this way before. So we were only able to have this conversation because of the detailed forecast of emissions that we were able to do through the TIGR analysis. And therefore, we are suggesting and recommending, highly recommending that we need funding to continue to do these detailed forecasts biennially. And every 4 years, we would use the forecast to update our roadmap. And we feel like updating the roadmap every 4 years is important, just given the pace and scale of emissions reductions necessary, and also how we've seen that we had a roadmap in 2020, a roadmap for achieving the 2020 goal, and we missed that goal. So I think there's this the first sub-recommendation is really getting at that and helping the commission be able to track and do the analysis that it needs to do. And then also getting to a little bit of a conversation earlier this morning, the idea that we had both an electrification scenario and a hybrid scenario, and the recommendation is to move all of those actions under each scenario, but there may be ways to optimize moving forward. And there are a lot of critical choices about how, which pathway to take and which actions to do and challenges around them. And so ODO had separately, as part of its biennial energy report that we recently released, had suggested and recommended developing a statewide energy strategy. There are other states who have this type of energy strategy, and and we're recommending that the commission support that that effort. And then I just noted here that where certain things changed and how they were incorporated under that. So the third sub-recommendation here is we weren't as explicit and didn't highlight as well as we would have liked to the National Working Land body of work that needs to happen moving forward when we did the draft recommendation framework. So we tried to elevate that and put it as its own sub-recommendation, recognizing also that there's a bill this legislative session around the issue. And so this third sub-recommendation gets at that. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to continue to move that forward. And then the last...
Briefly, the broader description also includes doing the workforce and training study that I mentioned earlier in the meeting.
Thank you, Chair. And then this last sub-recommendation was in the prior draft recommendations framework, and also gets at some of the comments that were made earlier around there's some emissions that we haven't totally accounted for, consumption-based emissions around embodied carbon in building materials. So when materials are purchased and then imported into Oregon, and the materials are made outside of Oregon's borders, there are emissions associated with that and impacts associated with that. And DEQ currently maintains a consumption-based emissions inventory, and there is a lot more work, and also, as we spoke about at the last meeting, a lot of potential around addressing consumption-based emissions, particularly around embodied carbon and food waste. And so this last sub-recommendation would recommend that the legislature direct DEQ to do further study and provide recommendations on how to move forward on addressing consumption-based emissions. Okay, we've got two more here, and this one is a little bit complicated, or just there's a lot here. So this is on governance and accountability moving forward. So definitely would recommend staffing and resources for the Global Warming Commission for all of the work ahead. That includes a number of the things we've already talked about, including the resources to update the TIGR analysis, the ability to do more engagement and education and outreach around climate issues and the state's climate action. There are multiple positions that we've outlined in the recommendation that you'll see, two specifically related to the National Working Lands work, and then one to do the kind of baseline Global Warming Commission work that we've been doing for years. And as the amount of climate action has exponentially grown, we are also struggling with the 0.3 FTU that we have to be able to support the commission in their work to track and analyze and recommend actions. And then there's one position also noted for helping develop the action implementation plans that we talked about in the conversation earlier on the new TIGR actions, and generally just trying to keep the roadmap on track and organize around it. Then we've talked about the next two previously, but there are a number of agencies that back in 2007 were not on the list of non-voting members of the commission. And so the recommendation is to add many of the agencies that now are doing climate work that weren't on that list to the non-voting membership, so that those agencies can participate in the work of the commission, and there's a channel back and forth. And then also expanding the voting membership of the commission to include a youth representative and a member with experience in environmental justice. We talked about how important those particular voices are to the work on climate change, particularly given the intergenerational equity issue, and that environmental justice communities bear the disproportionate impacts of climate change. The next sub-recommendation was to require state agencies to annually report on their climate work and progress to the commission. Right now, it's a bit of an informal, there is no actual requirement for the agencies to report on their work, and it would be helpful to the commission to be able to get reports from the agency to be able to track what is happening and help coordinate. And then the next one is along those lines, being able to help better track, to set up some type of climate action and emissions dashboard where all of the information that is occurring on reducing reducing emissions and the sector-based goals, the work ahead on carbon sequestration, the work that we talked about earlier about future study on consumption-based emissions and tracking those, and then all of the work that is happening at the state agencies on climate action, having that kind of all in a one-stop shop place for folks to be able to see it and understand it, and it would help the commission also do a little bit more outreach and engagement to have that available. So that is also one of these sub-recommendations. Then the last
Zach,
two are, yeah.
Sorry, Zach. I know at our meeting, either in November or December, we, and I believe it was Commissioner Jackson, but not positive, suggested and supported one of the public comments we got that included education And so is that where you see that idea that we include an education piece? It's part of E?
Yeah, and part of a couple of other places we've sprinkled it throughout. So this emissions dashboard would certainly is intended to be able to provide education and allow the commission to do more outreach related to the state climate action. And then also the sub-recommendation A to get more staffing and resources for the commission to do the work that the commission is directed to do, including education and outreach, would be under there. And then some of the engagement recommendation that I mentioned as part of the new TIGR actions, having work done to be able to engage with communities around implementation and development of programming were the places that we were thinking that would be covered.
Great, thank you.
Great, so the last two here are basically to reinforce the requirements in the in Executive Order 20-04 that direct the state agencies to consider and integrate climate mitigation and adaptation into their decision making, as well as equity into their climate mitigation and adaptation efforts. And we added and provide adequate resources to build the agency capacity to facilitate that. I think, you know, that hopefully will help. There's a lot of work ahead. And so also helping the agencies have support to do this work is important. All right, so this is the last recommendation, and then would love to have discussion with the commission about initial reactions and the like. But the last one is on federal funding, and we we tried to detail out a little bit more in these sub-recommendations what we meant by that. And so one is to ensure coordination across the state agencies to pursue the funds. Many of the federal funds that are coming available will be competitive in nature, and so Oregon will be competing with other states to try to get these funds, and so it's important to try to help make sure that the state is putting its best foot forward, and we're thinking that, you know, ensuring coordination across state agencies would help with that. Also supporting complementary programs, regulations, and incentives that increase the likelihood of receiving and maximizing the use of the funds. There are one of the programs, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. There has been conversation about the central distribution mechanism being a green bank or green banks throughout the U.S. And, you know, Oregon currently doesn't have a green bank. Other states do, and so doesn't mean that Oregon has to have a green bank per se, but that is an example, and the commission had recommended in its last biennial report to the legislature that a green bank would be a good idea for the state to do. So that's just an example of a complementary program that could help leverage and get the federal funding. And then the last one here is to provide opportunities for public input, engagement, and outreach, particularly for and with environmental justice communities. There is a strong push in the federal work as part of the Justice 40 initiative to ensure that 40% of the dollars are used to help benefit environmental justice communities. And there are also a lot of current state efforts to try to maximize that and make that happen at the state level. And so making sure that all of this is coming together to be able to really maximize the use of the funds to provide the benefits to those communities who experience the disproportionate impacts of climate change and also can very much benefit from some of the climate action solutions that are coming forward. So with that, I thought I would stop and see if folks have questions or thoughts, comments.
Yeah, first I'd want to just recognize that there's some additional folks representing commissioners and commissioners that have joined us. Garrett Martin from the PUC is with us today as a stand-in for the PUC. Suzanne Carlson is here representing ODOT, and Suzanne has a comment that I'll give her the floor when I'm done. Director Benner joined us quite a while ago, but I think just after we did the roll call. And I believe Judith Callens is back and representing Department of Agriculture. Suzanne Carlson, do you want to weigh in?
Sure, thanks. Hand down, off mute, all that. Okay, great. Thanks, Zach. This is a lot of work, a lot of information. I'm definitely digesting it a little bit. If you could go up to recommendation 5 for a moment, I think that's where I primarily had comments. Some people know that ODOT is pulling together a transportation emissions dashboard. It's a lot of work. It's taken us many times more time than we thought it would. A lot of coordination across state agencies. So I think my caution here is that reporting annually is super often. When it really comes down to it, by the time you finish one report, you're getting ready to do the next one. So I think maybe a part of this, or maybe a bullet that comes above some of these, is look at the coordination tables that happen now and see where you can supplement or aggregate. So we've got there's the BIZEV and the biannual energy report. Those are pretty comprehensive. And those are the kind that as soon as you finish, you start again. So there's a few different reporting avenues. There'd probably be some redundancy into some of us creating an annual report to the Oregon Global Warming Commission that might be captured in some other places. So just kind of from an effort level and a duplication level, we might just map this out a little more thoroughly before committing to it as worded.
It's a really good point, Suzanne. And we definitely don't want to do anything that's make work. And so I think your idea of let's look at what are the reporting requirements that we already have, and then do those completely satisfy what the commission would need, or, could you add like a cover to an existing report you're doing that would maybe add some of the elements that might be missing, but not have to produce two different things, or not, not a full rehash of something that might be well reported already. So good point.
And I'd probably add that to the last two about the requirements as well. We have other platforms where we're being required to do things. So it might just be looking at what's in place.
Great.
Not objecting to any of the work, just looking at ways we can make sure it's the same directives from different places.
Nicole Singh.
Yes, I just wanted to kind of also echo those comments, repeat them back, because I think in many respects here at DEQ, there's lots of different emissions reporting, and there are lots of different tools that we have. So, making sure that we're not duplicating or being efficient as we're thinking through this.
Absolutely. I see that, Gabriella, you had a question, maybe also on recommendation 4.
Yeah. Just when we were a couple slides, I think it was on recommendation 4. And I'm not sure exactly what the dividing line is between recommendation 3 and recommendation 4. There seems to be a little overlap, but for future studies, it's something that we've talked about, and it's in the note, but we've talked about the fact that we don't have comprehensive information about, you didn't get the resources to be able to have the consultant team really dig in and fully evaluate the co-benefits. And we certainly spoke today about not being able to fully capture either the greenhouse gas reduction or cost effectiveness of some actions that currently rank lower. So, and I just didn't see in the categories of these studies, and maybe I'm missing it. So Zach, that would be great if you can point out whether any of these do address those needs that the commission has discussed.
Yeah, thank you. So sub-recommendation A, to be able to have funding to do the biennial forecast of emissions is part of that. So we were thinking that the forecast of emissions is the kind of cornerstone of the then conversation around co-benefits and the like. And so we were thinking that that would also be, because we would use it every 4 years to do an update of the roadmap, that we would be hopefully getting funding from the legislature to be able to do that as part of the update of the roadmap. And maybe we can be more clear about that in our description, as well as the, you mentioned the dividing line between recommendation 3 and recommendation 4, this sub-recommendation C here, the third one, was also really trying to get at that so that we have I'm not sure we know exactly how to best do the co-benefits analysis, and there's also new tools that will be available with the environmental justice mapping tool. And so the idea was that as we're working through the new action through the recommended through the TIGR process, that we could use that as kind of a pilot or a way to start to understand how to best do the co-benefits analysis and frankly, the engagement that needs to happen to be able to inform that co-benefits analysis for future roadmaps. And so that's particularly why we, at the end of this sub-recommendation, put in informed best practices for future roadmaps, with the idea that it may be that we need additional dedicated money to be able to do specific engagement or get consultant support and the like, and hopefully that would come out of some of this experience and conversation around these actions.
Yeah, and I think that certainly is great, especially in terms of qualitative data that you would get from that kind of engagement. And I don't know what the right characterization is, but if the impression is that we need to redo what we did last time, we need to update what we did last time, but in some of the subcommittee conversations that we had, you were able to kind of explain the pieces or characterize the pieces that the current study wasn't able to cover. And I don't know if that's just, okay, just expanding scope of work, but it seemed like it was the nature of the work itself. It was different than what these folks were capturing in the current study. If it's just, we need to, I guess maybe it's just flagging the need to expand the scope of work, resources commensurate to expand the scope of work to more accurately be able to quantify, things that weren't resources to do in the first study, if it's just a matter of expanding the scope.
Yeah, good point.
And the other point I put in the chat was just noticing the recommendation about workforce in rural areas. It is very acute in rural areas, but it's statewide. And so we are grappling at OHA with how we are going to support navigation of people who there's going to be a lot of resources coming into the state, and there's legislation that I know Rep. Marsh and others, I think Rep. Pham, are spearheading, thinking about how to make sure, and I know Rep. Helm also has a bill about a hub to coordinate the funding that's coming into the state. But there's a big workforce piece that needs to be on the agenda to be able to upgrade all those electrical systems and install all those heat pumps and, you know, on and on. So really want to underscore how important that is.
Absolutely. Other questions or comments, reflections on the recommendations? Did Zach's explanation, if it was Commissioner Jackson, that kind of reflect what you were thinking about relative to having a specific education recommendation? Or do we need to shine a brighter light on it? I think you're on mute.
Okay, sorry. Due to audio, I have to use my phone as well. I don't recall that Station 1 was mine, but definitely it's an area of interest as well. So this does look good to me, the recommendations presented.
Good, thank you. Michael, or excuse me, Senator Dembro, do you want to comment on the reporting and how that's addressed in Senate Bill 522?
Sure. Thanks, Chair. Yeah, I mean, let me say, first of all, I find this very, very helpful, the work that's been done on these recommendations. So thanks a lot, Zach, for it. It's very extensive. I think, you know, I really support these recommendations, but they definitely point to the need for us to pass something like Senate Bill 522 to you know, to move this work forward. You know, I was, you know, I would just say, and I put in the chat that what the legislation calls for, you know, it's looser. It calls for regular reporting of the agencies. And, you know, I think the commission can then decide, you know, how frequent does regular need to be. I would not want to put in annual reporting in statute. You know, I think that's something that, you know, can change over time. But, you know, the idea of regular reporting, I think, is something that we would all support.
Great, thank you.
And thank you, Senator Dembro. And I'll just say, you know, so the annual reporting sub-recommendation that we have in here is also recognizing that we have the requirement to deliver the biennial report to the legislature. And so we were thinking that it might be able to, would be helpful to ensure that we were getting the information, you know, on a regular basis to be able to inform that. And also see your point about the, you know, the challenges with annual reporting. So we will go back and try to think about also taking into consideration the agency comments that were made about some of the overlapping reporting requirements to try to figure out how to navigate this.
Great, thank you. Commissioner Ford.
Yeah, thank you. So I have the same concerns that have been raised about the reporting requirements here. We want to spend time doing things, not necessarily spending time writing lots of reports, but we do need to be able to measure performance over time. And so it seems, and I think it was maybe the Oregon Department of Transportation that made some comment about dashboards. And you know, I think that's something that the Oregon Global Warming Commission should think about is what are those key dashboard elements that we ought to be getting reported on that we can put into a dashboard. So it's easier for us, the public, the legislature, and other folks in the state administration to kind of see where we are. Are we moving in the right direction? Are we red, yellow, green? Where are we in the process? And so rather than long written reports, which take a lot of time, I'd rather see us invest some time and energy in the key dashboard metrics that we ought to be measuring against over time. And I think that could be a useful exercise going forward.
Thank you, Commissioner Ford. Commissioner Sheeran?
Yes, hi, thank you, Chair McDonald. I just wanted to comment on the notion of the dashboard. I do like the idea of sort of consolidating this information in a way that's clear and transparent for all parties involved, the regulated state agencies, the general public, certainly as well as our decision makers and legislators. The one concern I would just have though is that as we approach this, and maybe our recommendations should say as much, we should be trying to drive toward as much alignment in how greenhouse gas emission data is both collected and reported as we possibly can. We've had this in the past where different agencies sort of collected and reported out on whether it was clean energy or greenhouse gas emissions differently, and it creates a lot of confusion as well as for all involved, as well as additional reporting requirements, which means time and resources for those who have to provide that data on the other end. And toward that end, I mean, we have a very well-established GHG reporting program through Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. And so I might suggest that this build on that work to include additional data and metrics that they don't include, but that begin with that GHG, inventory as the core of this work moving forward.
Thank you, Commissioner Sharon. I guess a question for you, Zach, that's on my mind is when I was thinking about, what is the dashboard helping us do? It was more, I'm not sure I would call it dashboard, but like one place you could go that would have a link to a DLCD rulemaking process, and a brief statement on the purpose, and a link to DEQ's latest emissions report and things like that would kind of be, you could go here, there would be some foundational information, and then kind of a update on what's happening where. That's what was in my head, but I'd be interested in hearing from you, Zach, as to what you were thinking, and then maybe Alan.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. No, that's exactly what I've been thinking as well. The idea that we would have the kind of base data and information that Commissioner Sheeran was just speaking about, the DEQ, greenhouse gas inventory, other emissions related data, and then also be able to have a place where if someone from the public is interested in engaging on a particular action that's moving through through a state agency, that they would have a place to even know that was happening and where to go. So it would be this central place where folks could find what is happening on state climate action, to be able to then have the opportunity to go to other agencies' websites and participate in rulemakings and the like, and as well as help the commission track that information in case the commission also, commissioners, were interested in trying to engage there as well.
Yeah, in some ways, I think when we talked about it earlier, you and I, Zach, we were kind of thinking of the function that the Carbon Policy Office under your leadership, Commissioner Sheeran, was able to pull all the information together from the executive order planning that was done by the agency. So I think that was kind of what was on my mind. Before I go to Alan, Zach, how much time do you need to talk us through the goal recommendation?
I probably need 5 to 10 minutes for the presentation. Let's say 10 minutes, and then would be great to leave maybe 15 to 20 minutes for conversation.
Okay, then we have to be very brief. Alan, do you have a brief comment?
Yeah, I was just going to underscore that the whole notion of the reporting in the dashboard is not intended to be report focused or report heavy. It's really intended, as Chair McDonald said, to be focused on existing data sources to the extent that we can, and ease the load on agencies to be able to get the data to us. So focusing on what we already have. But one of the things that became very clear during the TIGR process is that we do not have a lot of data in a lot of different places, and we're going to over time need to beef that up. And there's going to be probably over time easing into different data requests for the information that's actually necessary to track all this stuff. So it's not that there's not going to be any new data. It's that it's going to be start out with what we already have, but then ease into, I think, over time with the data that we need to start collecting in order to do something. Just the analysis we were doing, there were several actions we just couldn't even evaluate because we didn't have data on them. And then when we got to the specific evaluation criteria, again, ran in that same problem. So that's part of what's intended for this.
And Nicole Singh, do you have another comment, or is your hand up from earlier?
I will be very brief, Chair. I just, in this conversation, I just wanted to echo from here at DEQ, you know, we obviously do have a lot of data, and I just wanted to kind of share that with, you know, working through Zach and others who are thinking through how this can be put together. You know, we've been working a lot with data, and I think we've been also thinking through how to present data in a way that's very accessible to the public. So as an agency that's been collecting data for quite a while on emissions and then thinking through this, you know, hopefully we have ways in which we can make this process work better. So I recognize Alan's points, but yes, lots of times there's missing data. I think lots of times for programs, we do have that data, but we necessarily haven't had all the resources to be able to find ways to communicate out effectively on that data. But I just also want to say, you know, we do have a lot of experience here with thinking through how we can better visualize data and communicate that to the public. So that's been really top of mind for our emissions reporting team here. So happy to kind of think through that and share that experience and as you guys are drafting through the recommendations.
Great. Thank you, Nicole. You are such a key, DEQ is such a key partner for the commission. So we really appreciate all the work that you do. I'm going to suggest we turn it back to Zach, and then we can come back and have comments near the end of the meeting too.
Sounds good. Thanks, Chair McDonald. All right. So I know some folks were not at the last meeting, so some of the stuff that I talked through may be a repeat, but want to just help everyone be grounded in the analysis that we did to try to come up with the recommended updated sector-based goals. And I have already talked through a little bit about our thinking on why we did, why these items are highlighted, and would love thoughts, you know, on these after I get through the sector-based piece, and then want to touch base on the net zero emissions goal, and then make sure we talked in detail about the best available science mechanism that we're suggesting, but would also love to get folks' thoughts. But the focus of this is to try to really zero in on the 2050 goal if we can, and get some more direction on that, because we left it a little bit open on the 90 or 95% at the last meeting. All right, so this is an updated chart from what folks saw at the last meeting, and it sounded like it was helpful, so we stuck with it, but there's a little more ornaments to it. So just at the high level, you know, we needed some way for the commission to be able to see what the science is saying around the need for emissions reduction, what other states are doing around emissions reduction, and then also what our state goals, our executive order goals, and our TIGR scenario projections provide in terms of emissions reductions. And so the thing is, those goals across these different sources differ by baseline year, by the amount of reduction, and the ultimate year that that reduction has to happen by. And so this was the best way that we could come up with to try to essentially equalize these across. And what we did was, you can see on the left side column are all the sources, and then the targets in the next column. And then the section of columns after that with the numbers are, if you took the baseline in the target and applied it to Oregon's emissions, so what Oregon's emissions were in, say, 1990 or 2005 or 2010, and then use the goal like 40% or 45% below to calculate a number for each of the years based on what the goals say. So these, we only highlighted a few states. There were more states that we provided last time, but wanted to be able to get this all in one slide. And also, Washington and California being highlighted here are, given that they're our West Coast neighbors, seemed the most appropriate for the conversation. Okay, so then as I mentioned, we also included the TIGR scenario projections, which is the one line of data that we have data for each year, which is helpful to kind of serve as a bit of a bellwether benchmark for comparing the rest of the targets. The other piece that I wanted to highlight before we start to try to compare is to see about middle way down the chart, the IPCC. There's multiple entries for the IPCC, and the items that are highlighted are new things that we added. And so we kind of did a 101 IPCC chart at the last meeting, and this is a little bit of the 201. And I think just at a very high level, it doesn't really change anything, but we wanted to help folks understand why there were differences. Because if you look at the two rows, so the second row under the special report, the CO2 row, and then the first row under the sixth assessment, which says all greenhouse gas emissions. Those were the ones that we presented to you all last time, but presented them essentially as equivalents, which can be the case, and that's how many states and how these goals are reported, because CO2 is the principal greenhouse gas. So what IPCC does is they do a number of scenario projections and then report the median of those, the reductions from those scenarios. And they report it both as all greenhouse gas emissions and CO2 emissions. And you can, for the summary of for the policymakers, they sometimes highlight certain years, and you can dig deeper into the report to actually find the trajectory of the reductions that need to happen. And so basically this is an effort to give you all the another level of information to be able to compare with, and to also help explain why when we were first looking at this in the two rows that have the regular text not highlighted, or not fully highlighted, if you look over at 2050, there was a difference in that the IPCC special report called for net zero by 2050. The latest one called for 84% by 2050, and didn't note a net zero goal when we were talking about it. But if you drop down, you can see that actually, if you were to look at it from the CO2 side, which is how which is what the net zero goal from the IPCC 1.5 report is, there's also a net zero trajectory by 2050 to 2055 in this latest report. So it's a very similar match. And so the data is largely consistent, and just wanted to help the commission understand that extra level of information. And the one takeaway that we have is that because we dug a little deeper into that data, we also have some numbers from the IPCC projections for 2040 to help benchmark. So you can see we, in the sixth assessment, we would get down to 20 if we use those goals for all greenhouse gas emissions. We would get to 20 if we use them based on the CO2 emissions. We would get to 13. And if you go up to the top row, that's where our recommendation is currently, and that is 17 would get us basically in the middle. Okay, so I'll stop going down the IPCC route, but we added this row about what our recommendation would do, because you can start to then see, comparing each of these, how which targets we use result in different areas. The other thing is that California, we in our last report, in our last presentation, had cited the statutory goal for California of 48% below, 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. But they just released a scoping plan, which has more authority because it's from an agency that then gets adopted, that actually would go above and beyond that statutory goal. And that's the goal that's highlighted there to, again, give you the latest and greatest of what the other states and jurisdictions are looking at. And then also California, in addition to their net zero by 2045 goal, has a net negative direction thereafter. So once it achieves net zero in 2045, it would shoot for net negative beyond that. So those are all the changes, and then you can spend some time and go through all of the differences and the like if you'd like, but wanted to be able to help you see that and have this information.
And Zach, you've got some additional information to present that partially speaks to the question that Senator Denbrough asked last time, which is, what is the difference between hitting 85, 90, or 95, especially relative to the ag and industrial sectors?
Yep, that's coming. I got one more slide to tee that.
Thought it was. I just wanted to flag that for Senator Denbrough.
Yeah, so so after going through and doing these comparisons, we ultimately ended up with the top row as a recommendation. And part of that was because we presented these options to the commission. So there was option one at the last meeting to set goals for 2030, 2040, and 2050, or option two to keep them in the same cadence as our current goals, 2035 and 2050. And then we presented a number of, we presented suggestions of what those goals should be. And you can see under option one, that was informed by the science that we just talked about, the Tigger scenario projections and the Washington goals. And then in option two, we actually used a projection for the 2050 goal using the target that the Climate Protection Program currently uses, but that is only for a subset of emissions, but we extrapolated it out to provide a comparison, a comparator goal. And so that's to where we basically left off, and folks said the 2030, 2040, and 2050, option one would be the best to try to keep Oregon on track with its goals. And then there was some question, which Chair McDonald was alluding to, which is, question about like, well, what's really the difference between 90% or 95%? So we tried to detail that out a little bit. And so this chart is a projection based on, so our 2040 goal on this assumes our 2040 goal of what we're recommending, which is 70% below 1990 levels by 2040. And then it draws a straight line. There's a lot of assumptions there, but that's the best to come up with in the few days that we had to do this. So these straight line trajectories show at least what the trajectory difference would be if you started from 2040 and had a 90% goal or a 95% goal. And if you add up the difference between those two lines, it's cumulatively approximately 16.5 million metric tons of emissions that you would emissions reductions that you would be able to achieve if you had a stronger 95% instead of the 90%. And ultimately, we're talking to put numbers on it, specific numbers of where we would be in 2050. 90% would get us to 6 million metric tons of remaining emissions, and 95% would get us to 3 million metric tons. Okay, California has many staff who are, doing lots of projections, and to really truly answer the question, what is the practical impact of 90 versus 95%, it would take a lot of analysis. So this is one shot to just give you a sense. And then the next shot is to say, okay, let's kind of look at what others have done around this analysis to try to figure it out. So for the California scoping plan, they have basically done an analysis to show how emissions would change in terms of reduction to meet their 2045 goal. And so their 2045 goal, if we were to apply that to our Oregon emissions under the 90% trajectory, we would be very close to achieve. We would be at, under that projection. Let me go back to this. So under that projection, we would get to 9 million metric tons in 2045. If you were to do the 90% trajectory here, that would put us at 11.5 in 2045. So about 2.5 above where California's 2045 would be. And then if you were to do 95, that would get us to 10 million metric tons, which is just 1 million metric ton above what California's would be. So that's also why looking at California's analysis could help us inform this question. And really, the important pieces here in particular are, if you, so you can see the different sectors here that are with different colors. And if you look at 2045, you can see the remaining emissions really center around agriculture and industry, industrial emissions. So those are the two sectors that would need to do more moving forward if to meet those, to potentially meet those goals. So that just gives you a sense. Now, it's hard because we also, as part of the TIGR analysis, did not include agricultural emissions in the analysis of the new actions to meet the goal. We included it in the overall emissions total, but the TIGR actions that we've discussed all morning about moving forward are focused on getting the emissions and achieving the 2030 goal through sectors beyond the agriculture sector. It does include some industrial emission reduction. So just to give you a picture of, it's a little hard to compare. Now, this is the last slide here to just, this is actually, speaking of dashboards, the TIGR analysis, all of the data is available on a dashboard that SSG has put together. And this is one cut of what you can take from that data. And so this is showing under the current goals where we would get from 2019 to 2050. And what you can see again is that because we don't have agriculture in here as actions, you don't really see it in these bar charts, but the industrial side, you can see similarly to the California plan, scoping plan, that is the main remaining emissions that need to be reduced to try to get to a 90 or a 95% goal. So that
Zach?
was, yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, finish your thought.
Yeah, I was just going to say that's what we, were able to do without doing a ton of modeling, with the high level point being that it would agriculture and industrial emissions are the ones that would likely need more work to get to the to a stronger 2050 goal.
If you could go back to the scoping plan, I'm assuming that the industrial emissions that are shown in red are their process emissions and not their use of energy, because all of that, I assume, is in electricity generation. Is that a correct assumption?
I actually don't know the answer to that. I'm not sure, because they have, I have not dug into the scoping plan that deeply in what California, how they allocate the emissions to be able to answer that. But,
no worries.
And then,
oh, go ahead.
It's fair, at least for the ones that we were talking about in the graph that I showed from Oregon, that industrial process emissions would be the ones that are likely the ones that need to be reduced more.
Yeah, that was my assumption. And we do, Nicole, correct me if I'm wrong, we do separate out kind of the process emissions from the energy use emissions in the industrial sector. Is that correct?
There's different ways in which the data is reporting. I think Chair McDonald, if you're asking, how the climate protection program works when we're thinking about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, that's true. We basically have the energy associated emissions for industrial processes are incorporated under what we call the CAP portion. And then there's a separate program which is targeted towards the industrial process emissions.
I was thinking more about the emissions reporting that industry does. And I feel like Elizabeth has shared information where that's split out or can be split out. Is that?
Yes, that's true.
Okay,
Yes.
so we could take a closer look at that to better understand that distinction, make sure. And Zach, you're saying that was included in or those were separated in the graph that you got from SSG?
Saying the industrial emissions are separated from process emissions, are separated from the energy emissions of industrial.
Yeah, good. Okay. I just wanted to make sure on that. And then my understanding is that and again, Nicole, correct me if I'm wrong, that the majority of the current emissions that get reported for agriculture in our sector-based inventory are associated with enteric with livestock. Is that correct?
You know, Chair McDonald, let me just confirm that and get back to you.
Okay, thank you. And I mean, there are some exciting things happening on that front, looking for ways of really reducing emissions from livestock. So makes me hopeful that, you know, there would be ways that would be beneficial to the producers and to our overall emissions from the ag sector. Any questions for Zach? We're not trying to finalize this recommendation today, but wanted to kind of take stock if you think we're headed in generally a good direction, maybe with a little more information that we might want to have before we finalize the number. Senator Dembro.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. So, you know, looking at the 90% versus 95% question, am I correct in assuming that if we went to 95, then we would be more or less consistent on the West Coast? That, you know, I think that's an attractive prospect if that's true. But I am wondering about why the CPP set it at 90% fairly recently. Do we have an understanding of that?
That's a great question. Is that something that, Nicole, you can speak to?
Yeah, I would just say from the staff agency perspective and, you know, in speaking with the decisions that the Environmental Quality Commission meant, you know, there were quite a lot of considerations in terms of setting the targets. And I would just say definitely one of the things that came up in that conversation was science-based targets. So that all informed the decision by the EQC to adopt a program where we have the targets of the program that we do, such as the 90% by 2050.
And does it, just to follow up, does the CPP target also have a net zero component to it, Nicole, or is it just focused on the emissions reduction?
It's emissions reductions. So currently right now there's we call it a target for that 90% by 2050, and then there's an interim target too. Did I answer the questions?
Yes, yes. I will say I'm attracted to the net zero target as well. I think that's a really good component.
I was wondering whether we should adopt California's proposal to get to be net negative, you know, in addition to net zero. Any reaction to that?
I like it, Chair McDonald.
Thank you. Other folks want to weigh in? I'm not seeing any hands. I did see that Elizabeth Elbel is with us. So Elizabeth, I don't know if you can answer that question about the ag emissions. Well, I just put you on the spot. So I guess I want to.
I don't know what happened. Yeah, can you hear me? Okay,
Yes,
sorry,
we can.
my connection's a little rough. I was going to respond. So in the agriculture sector, the way the sector-based inventory works is it doesn't include emissions from energy use in that sector. So there's no electricity or natural gas. It's all just the agriculture emissions. And I was going to say, yes, I confirm that enteric fermentation is the largest portion of that. But just to clarify, that's not reported data to DEQ. That's model data where we do use state level input, so agricultural statistics to model that, but we don't have it directly reported to DEQ.
Thank you. That's helpful. So, any added direction that commissioners want to give relative to the adoption of goals? And mostly I'm just looking for direction so that we know what recommendation to bring back. Commissioner Sharon?
Yes, I guess I would just like to have us to consider a little bit more and maybe hear from DEQ any potential implications if we move from the 90% to the 95% in terms of the CPP. Important that people are focused on implementation and moving forward with some certainty in these early years to lock in those near-term reductions. And I would hate for a change out by 2050 to somehow imply that elements of the program would need to be rethought in the near term in a way that could jeopardize immediate emission reductions.
That's a very wise point, Commissioner Sharon. And I won't put DEQ on the spot for that, but perhaps we should follow up, Zach, with DEQ after the meeting and dig in on that.
Yeah, I guess to that point, and we can definitely follow up. I recall at the last meeting we discussed that question as well, and I think at the time the sense was that it wouldn't change a need.
That's right.
It wouldn't change the CPP, or it wouldn't be a problem for the CPP to operate in a environment with that 95% or 95 or 90%. But we will confirm.
Great, that sounds good. And maybe we can add to that conversation of just a little more conversation about the potential around process emission reduction in the industrial sector and and what it might look like in the ag sector. Okay, and Nora, you support the stronger 95% reduction. I think to the question that you raised, Senator Dembrow, we could certainly find out from ARB what they think their 2050 number for the sector-based emissions would be, given that they've kind of translated that to a net negative. So that might be a piece of information that we could track down and report back on.
Yeah, that's kind of a little bit of a proxy for that. The straight line projections that are here, we could also match those with a California straight line projection to 2045 to help folks see that. I talked through it, but it might also help to have a visual, and to Senator Dembrow's point, show also Washington at the same time, so that folks can see both the trajectories of all of these, plus the actual what the actual remaining emissions would be in each year under each of those. Might be able to provide that comparison to show that by doing one or the other, 90 or 95% is more consistent with our West Coast neighbors.
Commissioner Potowski?
I'm mute. Yes, thank you, Commissioner Chair McDonald. And just to comment to Commissioner Dembro's assessment, like for a negative effect on lowering emissions. Unfortunately, it's like you have a half of a lemon and you start to squeeze it and you can get a lot of juice with a little bit of squeezing, but get those last drops of juice out of that lemon peel is really tough. And in the sense that this becomes very expensive. Now, not to say that we shouldn't have that as a goal, but a recognition that it's really tough to get those last bits of those emissions out. Thank you.
So you raise a good point. Senator Dembro.
Yeah, just following up on that, I mean, net zero, though, goes beyond emission reduction, right? It also includes what we're able to do on the sequestration storage side, right?
Yes.
So it's, I would say that becomes actually more doable in a lot of ways than the 95% in some cases.
Yeah, I think you're
Just
right.
looking at emissions reduction. I don't know, Zach, could you comment on that?
Yeah, I think so. I put up this chart as you were talking because it might help to talk through this a little bit. So let's start maybe with the federal goals. So federal goal is 50% below 2005 by 2030, and then doesn't have emission targets after that, and then gets to net zero. So conceivably, we could still, be emitting somewhere near what 2030 was and still achieve net zero at some point. So both Washington and California continue to have interim emission reduction targets to reduce emissions and make net zero have to do less of the heavy lift to address the emissions that are occurring. So Washington has the 2040 and then the 2050 goal. And then on top of that 2050 sector-based targets, they have the net zero there. So it's really driving at it from two directions to reduce emissions that are coming out and also to then sequester the remaining emissions and then later be able to go totally net negative if you can. So I think it seems like our West Coast neighbors are taking the tack of we need to both achieve net zero. We need to achieve net zero, and we also need to reduce emissions as much as possible prior to achieving that, so that the net zero then does less of the heavy lift. And given the global challenge of climate change, the ability to have less emissions in general, so that maybe California, Washington, or Oregon lands are actually helping, draw down emissions from, like helping other countries who may not have, or other states who may not have as strong goals to be able to compensate for that, so that we ultimately achieve the 1.5 limit, or stay under that 1.5 temperature limit from the IPCC.
Well, any feedback that commissioners want to give and the public about the idea of going to net negative and the idea of picking either 90 or 95%. We will bring a little more information back after we talk to our colleagues at DEQ. So we'll have that before we finalize this. But if folks can weigh in on that, that'd be great. We are past time, and I do want to check and see how many people we have that want to provide public comments. So Linda, can you give us a sense of that?
I have no one listed.
Ah, okay.
And I don't have anyone in the chat as well. So
okay. We'll do a last call for public comments. And maybe while people might be weighing in on that, is there anybody opposed to thinking about net negative and 95%, assuming that we have a good product, assuming that we don't get any big red flags from our folks at DEQ or others on being that aggressive?
Excuse me, Kathy, we do have someone.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and have folks, given that we just have one, let's go ahead and have commissioners respond to that proposal if you've got concerns or have other information that you'd like to see in order to finalize a decision. I don't see any hands. Okay, well then I think we can go to public comment, unless you had anything else that you wanted to say, Zach.
Thanks, Chair McDonald. Just one other thought that I wanted to mention based on Senator Bembo's last question and discussion around achieving net zero and whether to set target sector-based targets as well as the net zero and when to do that. Is that, achieving net zero also, at least in the IPCC scenarios, requires some type of technology to sequester carbon. We certainly have national working lands to do the work, but there's also some technology that, you're relying potentially on some uncertain technology to be able to get us there. So also it's a bit of an insurance policy to also set emission reduction targets on the way in addition to net zero in case that technology doesn't work out or doesn't deliver in the way that it's estimated to in the future.
Thank you, Zach. Linda Craig, looks like you are on deck to provide public comment. Welcome.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, hello. Chair McDonald, commissioners, I'm Linda Craig, and I'm a volunteer with Metro Climate Action Team in Portland, and also just an interested member of the public. And I have been following your work over the last year with great interest, along with the work of the Rebuilding Task Force. And it was really good to see the chart that staff had developed that showed the overlap in the recommendations that you're considering and that the Rebuilding Task Force is considering. And I'd like to ask you to strengthen the placement of that chart in your report. I mean, in other words, to give it emphasis, because I think it will be really helpful for the legislature to understand that these two very strong programs have come up with pretty much the same kinds of conclusions about where we need to go in the built environment. So I'd like to ask you to please emphasize that. And I'd also like to just mention and support David Heslam's comments in the chat about the fact that the building performance standards and the materials related emissions action are also overlaps. And so you could consider whether you'd also like to highlight those two. So I look forward to your final report, and thanks very much for the opportunity to comment.
Thank you, Linda. Appreciate it. And thanks to David for the note in the chat. We do pull all the chat comments so that we have those for our record. So I appreciate you both raising that. Linda, anybody else sign up?
Nope. Okay.
Well, thank you. Great input. So I think we can go on to next steps. We talked about this at the top of the meeting. We are required by statute to provide a report to the legislature no later than March 1st, I believe. It's March 1st, maybe not. Maybe it's March 31st. But we are not, we are producing a standalone biennial report and the roadmap. And so we could complete the biennial report and delay the roadmap a little bit to make sure we, we get everything right in the way we want it. This is a pretty aggressive timeline, and I am mindful that it's been so much work that we've been getting things out like just in time, and I want people to, commissioners, to have plenty of time to consider this. So I did want to just call the question as to the preference of commissioners to try and stick to this schedule, or to give staff some flexibility to spend a little bit longer to get this roadmap produced. I would like us to get on to having conversations about implementation of actions and, reports from the Climate Change Research Institute, and, love to learn more about what ODOT's doing with the dashboard and the like. So I, on the one hand, I'm kind of interested in getting this done as quickly as possible, but I also just, staff have really been pushed to get to where we are. And there's still a significant amount of drafting, or at least synthesizing and editing that we need to do to develop the roadmap. So any druthers?
Chair McDonald, I have a quick thought on this. It's aggressive, but we also have momentum. So from my perspective, let's push through if we can and get it done. Because I'm with you, I'd like to move on to discussions about implementation. I'd like to spend a little more time focusing on National Working Lands work, what's going on there. So I know it's aggressive, and I know the staff have been obviously working very hard based on all the material that's been continuously flowing, but we do have some momentums, and I think the timing to get it into the legislature by the 1st of March hopefully will help members of the legislature be able to review and have some hearings and think some of this stuff through as well. So that's kind of my thought. We got to have steam. Let's get her done.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner Ford. Director Bateman.
Thank you, Chair. I don't think this will actually change your ultimate timelines, but we were wondering if we could have a few more days for comments just based on our previous discussion. I don't think it will change the recommendations themselves, and so we don't want to get in the way of that process, but maybe you could hold a place, have a little placeholder, or just make a little bit extra space for a footnote or some additional text, context around our previous discussions. So just wanted to let you know those are coming. If we could have a few extra days to put that together, that'd be great. But I think ultimately the essence of the report will remain the same.
Great, thank you. Yeah, we can certainly accommodate a little bit of back and forth with the agencies. And as you'll see, our proposal is to have the commission sign off on all the recommendations, have a subcommittee of the commission who would get to see the whole report and all of the context, but not try and bring the whole commission through a drafting and editing process. So that's our proposal. And I know that we would welcome state agencies' eyes on, the broader context, if that's important relative to the, to you as an agency, if that would be helpful.
Very good. Thank you.
Any other thoughts? Okay. Seeing none, then and comments to the public, love to get written recommendations by the 25th of January. We'll do follow-up with the EQ around the difference between 90 and 95% and relative to that goal. I think once we know that, we could set a date for net zero based on the preliminary work we've done with natural and working lands. So we could take a look at that and come up with a proposal. Any other comments for the good of the order?
Sorry, Chair McDonald, were you just saying net negative, or did you mean net zero?
Net
Yeah,
zero,
okay.
when we could do net zero, sorry. I mean, we
Okay.
might be able to say what we can do net negative too, but let's start with net
Okay.
zero.
You said that. I was just clarifying because right now the year that we have that is in the recommendations of 2050 or as soon as possible. And so I was just trying to figure out if you're suggesting maybe we would go to an earlier net zero goal. I just wanted to make sure I was checking that.
It's probably best to leave it the way it is. Now that I think about it more, and then once we have more information around the baseline for the land sector, then we can come back to it and move it up if we want, or if the information suggests that it would be good.
Great, yeah, and we can keep continuing in our conversations that we'll have over the next week or two with folks, figuring out what makes sense, but just wanted to clarify to make sure I was following up correctly.
And I will just put a plug in the, so as I mentioned at the top of the meeting, there is a website that was put together for the advisory committee, the Natural and Working Lands Advisory Committee. Their meetings are not open to the public, but they're all recorded. So you can go and listen in to the discussion. We've had really robust and very constructive conversations with the advisory committee, and all of the materials get posted pretty quickly after our meetings. So they're doing a great job of keeping it up to date, and a lot of great work is happening there. So I'm with you, Commissioner Ford. I want us to be able to talk about that in these meetings too, but just for those that might want to see what the conversations have been like, those are all recorded. All right, with that, I will close the January 13th meeting of the Oregon Global Warming Commission. And thank you all for your time and attention.